Hello, everybody, and thank you once again for joining me for my reaction series on the final season, part 2 of Attack on Titan. This week, today, we'll be continuing what is my favorite stretch of chapters in the story. Probably, I think it has to be. And continuing to see how this stuff is adapted and animated and presented to us in episode format. I'm super excited. I would be disappointed if this episode didn't end up being hugely enjoyable to me, but given what we've seen so far, minor gripes here and there aside, it's been super well done, and I have no reason to not have any confidence in them for this, and the rest of the adaptation. It's been a great experience so far, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and we'll be continuing with a very important episode today. Before we get into it, just another reminder that every week we do discussions on Twitch over on my Twitch channel where we talk about the episode, the presentation, how it was adapted, how the major character moments, the major plot moments, the themes of the episode connected to different parts in the past episodes of the series, and all that stuff. And there are no spoilers. At least I don't give any spoilers. There is always the chance of a random asshole in chat doing it, but we have mods, and we're very much on top of that. So if you want to join for those discussions, please feel free. You'd be welcomed in for sure, and I'd welcome discussing these things with you, or whatever you have to say about the episode. Also, if you would like early access to the next episode, right now, right after you watch this, the next episode is available on Patreon, as is the next, the second episode. So the next 2 episodes are currently available on Patreon when this goes live on YouTube, just for anyone who wants some early access and extra stuff, anything like that. Just a little something extra. With all that out of the way, let's just get right into it. Episode 5 of Final Season Part 2, which I guess would be 4x21. Let's do it. Okay, so we're going back. Yeah, they have not held back on any of the brutality in any of these conflicts. Good God. We are feeling everything Grisha did in that moment, not sparing any of the pain or the detail. Monstrous. Embodying that monstrous Attack Titan rage. And it puts this scene into perspective a bit more as well. Such a wonderful scene here. I can't stress enough how amazing this music is. Again, tonally, as I discussed last week.
まだ親父が俺に食われるところを見てないぞ。本当に時を超える能力があるのなら、都合のいい記憶だけをグリシャに見せて、過去に影響を与える。
That's important. He was selective with the memories he showed, and really emphasized it in the moments where he was transmitting it and applying pressure to him.
それをお前に託した。もっと先の未来を見たからだ。先にある何かをお前が見せたことで。あんたが俺を親父の記憶に連れ込んだおかげで、今の道がある。俺の望みではなく、お前の望みが叶う。
He's right. Again twisting the knife in.
あれを見たのは4年前。俺は親父の記憶から自分の未来を見た。あの景色を。始祖ユミル！すべてのユミルの民から生殖能力を奪え！
Again, she's still got that grainy filter, ever so slightly.
お前に従ったことを後悔した。父親の記憶からどんな未来の景色を見たか知らないが、お前は全てを見たわけじゃないんだろ。お前は無力なままだ。
Oh my God, the voice acting. Holy shit. That was...
一度動き出したユミルを止めることなどこの世の何者にもできない。
Nothing in this world. Oh boy. 2,000 years ago. Oh, and the music track. Oh.
もうこんなに読めるようになるなんて。だってお姉ちゃんが教えてくれるから。お、ダメだよ、鼻水垂らしてちゃ。ヒストリアはもうちょっと女の子らしくしないと。
this track always gets to me.
はい、噛んで。
And I love that they're playing it right here. That tenderness.
女の 子らしくって何？この子みたいな女の子のことかな。ヒストリアもこの子が好きでしょ？いつも他の人を思いやってる優しい子だからね。
Always thinking of others. Wow. The almost sepia-esque filter. Everyone's eyes grayed over. Wow. It's like a palpable feel of decay visually. Aged decay.
この世界は辛くて厳しいことばかりだから、みんなから愛される人になって。
Oh my god.
助け合いながら生きていかなきゃいけないんだよ。
この中に豚を逃がした者がいる。
Oh. I like the...
逃がしたのはお前か。
Once again, music choice. Spot on. She accepts this burden. You're free. This is a story that's consistently repeating itself. Truly free, right? Cruel but beautiful. Mostly cruel right here. Chills. Wow. Sound design again. Sorry, I keep gushing about it, but horrific. Also, story of parallels very obvious. In spite of everything, still sacrificed herself for him.
何をしておる？起きよ。お前がやりごときで死なぬことは分かっておる。食え、娘たちよ。ユミルの体をすべて食い尽くせ。マリア、ローゼ、シーナ。
Great shots.
ユミルの血を絶やしてはならぬ。娘が死ねば背骨を孫に食わせよ。孫が死ねばその背骨は子から子へ。
Tons of variation in the color palette this episode. I love how bold they are in every direction. It's all very intentional and it all plays a part, plays a role. So lonely. All alone.
我が五章においても我がエルディアはこの世の大地を個体で支配し我が巨人は永久に君臨し続ける。我が世が尽きぬ限り永遠に。終わりだ。 俺がこの世を終わらせてやる。お前は奴隷じゃない。神でもない。ただの人だ。誰にも従わなくていい。お前が決めていい。決めるのはお前だ。お前が選べ。ユミル、俺の命令に従え。全てのユミルの民から。俺をここまで導いたのはお前なのか。待っていたんだろう。
The look in his eyes here, so
ずっ
telling.
と2000年前から誰かを。
First time we see her eyes. I have full body chills. I can't believe I'm seeing this. Oh my, the scale, the occasion, the weight. Oh my god. He did it.
僕たちが勝った。ねえ、エレンが始祖を掌握した。エレンは味方だ。そうに決まってる。
Is he? He has to be.
味方。ウォルマリアの壁まで崩壊している。
Oh my god.
マーレの連合軍を潰すだけならこんなに必要ないよ。
Oh my god. Oh.
死がマーレに集結した連合軍を潰すだけなら、それだけならこんなに。
全てのユミルの民に継ぐ。俺の名はエレン・イエーガー。始祖の巨人の力を介し、全てのユミルの民へ話しかけている。俺の目的は俺が生まれ育ったパラディ島の人々を守ることに。
Annie's
しかし世
father?
界はパラディ島の人々が死滅することを望み、
Flock.
この島のみならず全てのユミルの民が殺され尽くすまで止まらないだろう。
Historia.
そのこの島の外にある全ての地表を踏み鳴らす。そこにある命をこの世から駆逐するまで。
鉄の
Holy shit. Oh my god. Oh, I had full body chills for most of that. Full body chills. Oh my god. I can't believe it's here. The rumbling has started in earnest. They absolutely nailed the beginning of what could potentially be the end. Those last few minutes completely floored me. Oh, the music, the visuals, the color palette, great animation here and there, the overall, just everything about the presentation. Not to say the whole episode was perfect, and we'll get into that, but that was an experience, and I loved it. So I loved the episode. I thought it was wonderful. Like I said, kind of alluded to, I don't think it was perfect. I think there are some things that definitely could have been done better. One thing in particular, and I'll get to that. But nonetheless, I think it's conveyed and adapted all this material very well. I think it accentuated what it needed to accentuate for the most part, put weight on all the places it needed to put weight on. I am a broken record every week, but the use of music, the audio direction in general, I think was absolutely spot on and wonderful in every instance. We heard some new songs, at least I have never heard them before. They sound like Yamamoto works, Yamamoto pieces that were absolutely insanely good and just mesmerizing. I was a broken record throughout the episode itself, as well as I was talking constantly about how good the music was and the audio design. But it also did some very nice things with visuals. And anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. To start off with the structure of this episode, they did some rearranging. So what they did was, the end of the last episode ended with a little bit left of chapter 121. So what they did was a tiny bit of a recap, the Zeke and Grisha hug. Then they finished 121, which ended pretty much where the OP started. So 121 ended right there with Eren running after Ymir. And then pretty directly follows 122, pretty much to a T. Pretty much 1-to-1, with very little changes, if any. So there's that. Then we go to 123. Now, most of chapter 123 contains a series of scenes or so, that they have rearranged here. There's no way they're going to cut this material. No way in hell. I know this because it's essential to the story, and the people behind this, the staff behind this, know not to cut this stuff. It would be shooting themselves in the foot to a great degree. So they seem to have rearranged this. I'm not going to spoil what it is, obviously, because we'll see it in a future episode, no doubt. But they've taken the bulk of chapter 123, and they've clearly saved it for a future episode. I have some predictions about where that could go. Obviously not going to discuss them here. But so they've rearranged that. As of how I feel about it, I think that some things are lost about the upcoming stuff, upcoming material, that lose a bit of weight because that scene is not here. But at the same time, I also think it could lend some weight by putting it in a couple of different spots in the future. So I'm not going to make any judgments about it. I don't think that it needed to happen, but I am pro adaptation freedom, right? If they decided that they wanted to try something different here and change this scene around, change the order, I'm okay with it. We'll see how it plays out, and if I have something to criticize once we see that, I'll criticize it then. Yeah, there are some things that are lost, but there are other things that can be gained, so we'll see how it goes. Like I said, there are logical places where I think it can go in the future, and I'm not going to talk too much about that right now, because we simply don't know as it stands. But yeah, so they skipped the majority of that to then get to the end of chapter 123, which basically consists of the whole scene where Mikasa and Armin realize that the rumbling's happening. It literally starts happening past the scene where Gabby sees Eren come up and start transforming. So it basically starts right there, which is the ending third or quarter or so of chapter 123, and carries on right through all the way until the end, where we get that hugely frightening, bold still frame of Eren's intensely scary face. So yeah, what it does is adapts the end of 121, all of 122, and the end of 123, with the bulk of 123 clearly going to be put in a future episode. That's the structure and adaptation of this episode. Some creative liberties definitely taken. So, to talk about the overall presentation, which I've already kind of touched on, but yeah, audio visuals, pretty spot on again, particularly the audio direction. Every song was on point. Obviously, they start with a bit of a recap in the beginning, and again, that great use of tone in that song for the Zeke Grisha hug. I won't talk about that again, but it's used again here. But what I really want to draw attention to is right after the OP, the scene with Historia and Frida, a very tender scene, a very heartfelt scene, which I'll talk about a bit more when we get chronologically into the story. But I think the use of the song, what is it called? Okay, according to the soundtrack I've bought, it is called Symphonic Suite AOT in brackets Part 2 to 6th, Thanks At. Thank you for the interesting name, Sawano. But anyways, it's the song that occurs in Midnight Sun in Season 3, Episode 18, I think? Midnight Sun, you know what I'm talking about, where Levi is making the choice about whether to save Armin or Erwin, and this song starts playing as he thinks about and weighs the two decisions and thinks of Kenny and thinks of what Erwin's told him in the past, what Armin said in the past. And it carries forward until we see a flashback of Erwin saying, "Levi, thank you." and it's a real tearjerker, particularly because it's pretty inseparable from that context, but just in and of itself, it's very gentle, yet deeply, deeply emotional, and playing that here was very important, I think, for getting across the tenderness of this scene and the sheer core sadness of, well, there's some happiness, of course, with Historia and Frida, which we'll get into, but also the sadness of her situation. And then it transitioned into Ymir, whose life was nothing but suffering, and so the sadness really got across there. All in all, I'm just trying to say in a long-winded way, I think using that song was a great choice, because they haven't overused it in the series. They've used it for very important spots, and I think this spot was a good place as well. I got immediately emotional when I first heard it, I think you could see in the reaction. But then as we move on and Ymir gets accused for these things and she accepts that burden, we start with a very ominous, a little bit creepy, ethereal track, very chilling, lots of weight, though being minimalistic at the same time. Great approach, great subtle approach there for conveying the sheer gravity of this circumstance and how dark it is. And then as the sequence goes on and she gets brutally chased by those men, inhumanely chased, shot by arrows, and discovers the tree and goes inside and everything that happens, and then time goes by, the music just swells and swells. And I think it was tonally spot on. It gets grander and grander and very much begins emphasizing the horrors of all of this on a grand scale, from that very creepy, ominous, minimalistic beginning, from where Ymir accepts this burden to everything else that happened. Great, great track used there. It felt like it fit the scene directly. It felt like it was composed for this scene. But speaking of that sort of feeling, we then get to another track later on where Aaron's got his arms around Ymir and saying, "You're just a human being. You're just a girl. You're not a god. You're not a slave. You're just a girl, and you have the right to choose to be free." It's a lovely moment for reasons I'll get into in a bit. But we have Zeke chasing after Aaron. Everything's in slow-mo, and then we see Ymir's eyes come to the fore for the first time. They've been grayed out this whole time. And we hear this chilling chorus, the vocals. Oh, that sent chills up my spine immediately. And that chorus continued, again, building upon itself, getting grander and grander and more horrifying and chilling as the rumble starts in earnest. And just lets completely loose. Very operatic, very orchestral, very grand and sweeping, but horrifying at the same time. Like, this is it. This is happening. The music used was totally spot on. And in keeping with the audio, voice acting was really good. I think the voice used for King Fritz, the awful tyrant, the excuse for a human being, was very good, very much fit the character, but Yuki Kaji's screams as he's tearing himself out of those chains, literally ripping his own thumbs and parts of his hand off, you could feel his pain, and not even primarily the physical pain, because obviously he's going through physical pain, he's screaming because of that, but more than anything, the pain felt guttural, like it's coming from something deep within himself, pain at the prospect of his goal not being fulfilled, and pain at the prospect of Zeke's goal being fulfilled. And that was all communicated so brilliantly through Yuki Kaji's scream there. I read on Twitter that, I think he's tweeted that he lost his voice, or nearly lost his voice after that. You can feel that. He put his everything into that. And as well, very great, chilling, more calm and authoritative voice work when he's sending that message to all the subjects of Ymir. Really good. Just, again, the audio direction. I keep saying it, but it keeps being good. So as long as it keeps being good, I'm going to keep saying it every discussion. Then in terms of visuals, there were some nice bits of animation throughout. The spine thing that comes from Aaron's body was very cool, very dynamic. But something I want to talk about in general is the color palette. There were very distinct color palettes throughout, each to convey a different mood. We have in paths very deep, ethereal, otherworldly blues, which we've already become accustomed to, but they seemed even brighter here as we see sequences of Ymir putting together, sculpting these titans. We also have the muted, almost sepia-esque greens, murky greens and browns of Ymir's backstory, with everyone's eyes grayed out. It seems like everything's in sort of black and white for the characters, not quite, but nearly there, and then nearly sepia for the actual background art. Beautiful illustration throughout to portray this, and the color, it makes it feel very much like this old story, like this old like a storybook. But in and of itself, tonally, it tells a story of its own. Very muted, very gray, very just murky and miserable. And the context itself is murky and miserable as we see how awful this period of time was for anyone under King Fritz's rule, and particularly Emhyr, of course. This is a horrid, awful experience, an awful time to be living, and that is very much portrayed through this murky color palette. Then, when the rumbling begins happening, red, orange, violent reds and orange and darkness everywhere. Fire, there's backdrops of destruction to a much greater extent than in episode 2, what I was talking about, as the rumbling begins in earnest. And, these browns, all with these reddish tints as we see the Titans going. Again, very red, orange, brown, very dark. It is just cataclysmic in color palette. And there's destruction everywhere. There's hellfire. It's raining hellfire. It is the apocalypse, and it gets across so well through the visual direction and approach to color. Very bold. So 3 approaches in the episode. We have paths, otherworldly, distinct in its ethereal nature, abstract in the very bright blues and purples and the aurora. Then we have the very muted, sepia, murky tone of the Emhyr backstory, and then we have the hellfire, the destruction, the reds and oranges and blacks and darkness of the beginning of the rumbling. Very distinct from one another, each very effective, and offered great visual variability to the episode. And I love that. I love the different approach to the colors. I was a huge fan of that, and I hope they continue to be as effective visually as they were here. Though I do think it would be a bit much to hope for this much of variability in every single future episode, but I do hope they continue to challenge themselves in terms of color palette and visuals. One more thing about the music is that the song that plays as Emhyr, we see her alone in the Paths dimension, is very empathetic. It very much gets across her sheer loneliness as she takes on these tasks. And I love that approach. Again, music has a voice. Music can speak to you through tonality and approach and sound, and they very much have been doing this throughout the entire final season, part 2, and in particularly this episode, and that's another example. Now, this episode wasn't perfect, as I mentioned, and I do want to draw attention to one thing. There's a scene where Eren talks about what he saw when he kissed Historia's hand. He says, "I saw those scenes, this scenery." In the manga, there's a very specific softness and nuance to his expression here that was not translated well in the anime. Now, overlaying as he says that is a flashback of him kissing her hand. I understand that. I think that's a bit of a reminder. I think that's fine. But then when they actually go to his facial expression, it's much more unreadable than I wish it would be. It's much more hard and rigid. I think in that moment there had to be more expressibility, more nuance in there, more nuance in the expression than there was. Like I said, Isayama is a master at the character expressions and telling you so much and evoking so much through these very subtle bits of illustration. So I don't expect the anime to be able to emulate that directly. But here, Eren's expression was a bit too, again, like I said, rigid and unreadable. I think this, when he's talking about this scenery that I saw, it's a big moment in the story because it keys you into how Eren felt about what he saw. Was he horrified? Was he saddened by what he saw? Was he resolute? Was he a mix of all these things? How did he feel? And the expression, I don't think, was expressive enough to really key us into his mental state here. The manga does it in an indescribable way here. I'll show it really quickly on screen. I have the manga right here. Right there. A very soft, very nuanced, very human expression there, and in comparison to how they adapted, I just don't think it captures that same feel. So a bit of a criticism there from me. I don't think they captured that as well as they could have, but that's about it, to be honest. They could have done a bit more with certain scenes that were still framed, maybe a bit more motion, or a bit more to scenes here and there, if I'm being picky, but overall, the episode was fantastic, and I have very few complaints. Though that is a complaint to make note of course. So now to get into the events chronologically of this cataclysmic episode and talk about it. We start off with a bit of a flashback going back further to seeing the actual fight between Grisha and his Attack Titan and Frida, and we actually see him completely decimate the Rice family, minus Rod, of course. And I think that was effective in showing us, like, Grisha, we saw the sheer pain on his face, in his voice, and in his body language as he talked about all these things and how awful it was last episode. But here, through seeing it, we can really feel what he felt, not as much as Eren could when he talked about that to Zeke, not as much as he could, of course. But I think it's very important for putting us even more in Grisha's mindset and the suffering he endured. Then we get a replay of the hug between him and Zeke. Eren makes himself known to Zeke. They go back to the Path Dimension, and then we basically start the episode properly, minus the flashback. So early on, we get a very important line from Zeke that confirms something that's significant for the logistics of what happened in the memories. He basically confirms that Eren started manipulating these memories to only show Grisha things that were convenient to him, convenient to showing Grisha to force him to that end, to the end of carrying out the plan and destroying the Rice family and taking the Founder. Now, this is with regards to the things that Eren showed Grisha, which Grisha said in the previous episode, why did you only show me parts of it? So this is just a confirmation of that, but I think it's also important because this also indirectly explains certain things about what happened in that episode. Like, for instance, the fact that once Eren realized he could manipulate these memories, he also realized that he could manipulate and harness the fact that Grisha could see through him, which is why he was able to force Grisha into seeing these things when he saw them. We see throughout the episode, I talked about this in the Twitch discussion, but not in as much in the episode discussion, we see throughout the last episode, that Eren is shocked at first to see that Grisha can see things through his eyes, but starts testing it out. Like, there's a scene where Grisha is looking at the key and then looks at Eren shocked. And then Eren seems to be concentrated as he's trying something out. And he gradually gets better at it as the episode goes on. And then by the end, he is fully forcing this into Grisha's head to literally talk to him, basically. Literally manipulate him and be very intentional and forceful with it. So this line from Zeke not only confirms that stuff about showing Grisha these memories, but also how Eren was able to do some of the things he did. So I think it's very important to draw attention to that. With regards to the mechanics of what happened there. And like Eren says, Zeke, through trying to save him from indoctrination, essentially helped Eren to carry out things as they always were meant to be carried out, and to continue his will towards that end, that scenery. As Grisha says, everything will go as Eren plans it. And Zeke unintentionally helped him to do that. He would never have been able to do that if he didn't go into the memories for Zeke's very different intentions. And I think something that's very important here is that Zeke fears Eren. Zeke fears what he's capable of. He looks at him with true terror in his eyes and what he can do. And it's just a nice shift of the power dynamics, whereas at first Zeke was guiding him through and saying, I'll teach you about yourself. I'll show you what you've gone through. I'll show you that we're the same. Now things could not be any different as Eren gradually but slowly and definitely grasped this control and arrested this control from Zeke. And then we get to that scene where Zeke sort of parrots what Grisha has told him. Everything Eren's seen has come to pass. It's all this horrifying, awful stuff. What could Eren have seen? What is it? It was clearly not just what happened with Zeke. And if we're paying attention to the expression he gave in the manga that I showed you earlier, he looks at it with it's indescribable, but there's a softness there. There's hints of fulfillment. There are hints of maybe even a yearning for freedom in that expression, maybe even sentimentality. There are all sorts of things you can glean from that expression, and there's a softness to it that makes you feel as though that scenery was deeply meaningful to Eren. It wasn't as horrifying as Grisha saw it. Grisha saw it as horrible, but Eren sees it, again, judging by the manga expression that I shared with you before, not quite with the anime one, Eren sees it as wondrous, gratifying in some way, fulfilling. He looks at it with this wide-eyed wonder, this soft nuance in his eyes, and so that makes you wonder, what did he see? What did he see? What comes to pass that's so horrifying to Grisha and mesmerizing to Eren? We don't know, but we do know that he carries out the rumbling, and that may be a part of it, right? But is that all of it? You would assume that there's more to it than just that, or more of an elaboration. We'll see. And again, like I said, I won't rag on it, but yeah, I do think the scene was much superior in the manga, personally. Zeke then commands Ymir to carry out the euthanasia plan. She begins moving there, and then Eren, oh my goodness, like I said, Yukikaji screams, literally dismembers his hands, and like I said, it isn't just the pain he's going through, the scream isn't just because of the physical pain of going through cutting his thumbs off through those chains. It is through the pain he feels at the prospect of his plan, whatever this is, not being carried out, and Zeke's plan, the most anti-Eren plan in the world, the most anti-freedom, anti-we are born into this world plan being carried out. That is how much he vehemently opposes his plan. That is how much he hates it and thinks it's just abhorrent. And we hear that in that scream. There are multiple dimensions to it. A physical pain, and a psychological trauma and pain for the hatred of Zeke's and fear that his own plan will not come to pass. And it's very telling in that way. And Eren, as resolute and unyielding as ever, his conviction, we know all about it. We know everything about Eren Yeager. At this point, it's no surprise to us, but it's still impressive that through sheer willpower, he breaks out of these chains, his hands in pieces, to put his arms around Ymir and try and stop her and speak to her. And notably, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. As Zeke says, once the Founder starts moving, nothing can stop her. But he meant that physically. Eren would not have been able to stop her by just putting his arms around her and trying to stop her from walking. That wouldn't have worked. That wouldn't have done anything. But Eren, through being able to relate to her, through being able to relate to the concept of being enslaved, of being caged, not to the extent that she is. Eren has had a tumultuous life. We know this. He's gone through all sorts of things, and he's been caged from the beginning, and it's been inhumane to him to a horrible degree. He's experienced all sorts of awful things that have caused him to be this warped person at this point in time. I think it's fair to say that in some way he's warped, and that's in large part due to the things he's experienced and the world he was born into. But having said that, what Ymir has experienced, it is extremely hard to articulate and conceptualize the agony that she went through, not just through her life, which was miserable from start to finish on a level beyond anything I can really even comprehend. A life of being a slave, in every way, of accepting a burden of hatred, of being chased throughout woods and treated as sport, to finding the Titan and achieving this power, and then being used as an asset, again as a slave, being given the freedom to run away in the forest and have a snowball's chance in hell of escaping, and then being granted the freedom by King Fritz of or the honor of bearing his children. I'll allow you to breed with me. Like, what the insanely inhumane. And then, after all that, sacrificing her life to save his. But then, to me, the most horrifying part, and this says a lot because her life was horrifying, is the sheer loneliness she experienced after being transported to the Paths realm. Like we said, this is very important to really nail home the nature of her loneliness. Like we've said in past episodes, as Zeke said, time operates differently in the past dimension. It just isn't the same. 100 years can pass by in a second. It just doesn't flow the same. In one instant, in the real world, quote unquote, any number of years can go by. And so Ymir was tasked with in all these moments of carrying out these duties and creating these Titan bodies. When someone would transform in a Titan, she would have to carry out those deeds. When people would turn into Titans, when Titan powers would be used, any of that, she was responsible for it in this Paths dimension where all Eldians converge. And these things would happen in instants in the plane of dimension of the show. Eren would bite his hand, he'd turn into a Titan in a couple of seconds. Grisha would stab his hand, he'd turn into a Titan in a couple of seconds. And we take that for granted as it goes along. We just, Titan transformations, things to do with Titans, they are instantaneous. This is just a mechanic of this world. But they are only instantaneous because of the discrepancy in the way that time functions between the Path dimension and the real world. What is happening here is that Ymir, over who knows how much time is sculpting these things and transporting them into the real world. But how long does it take her to do all these things? She's assigned to do one thing, to transform someone into the Colossal. She does it, but who knows how long it takes her to do that? We see her painstakingly carrying that pail, wandering through all these sculptures that she makes out of this sand, this clay. It takes an indescribable amount of time for her to be able to do these things, constantly. We see how many transformations occur, how many things to do with Titans occur. She is the root, the heart of all of it. She is the reason any of it comes to pass. All of this magic is the result of what she's doing in that dimension. But for her, it isn't an instant. She has to painstakingly do it every time. Who knows how long that takes? That takes centuries. I wouldn't be surprised if it took centuries. And she's all alone doing this for... Like Eren says, 2,000 years in their time. In her time, it is impossible to describe how long she's been alone, just doing these tasks as this slave. Carrying out what's been assigned to her by King Fritz. So inhumane, so awful. And so that really drives home her loneliness more than anything. I think you really have to think of the mechanics of the path dimension in contrast to the real world, what Ymir is really doing here, how long that takes in contrast to how long it takes in the real world. What has she been doing all this time, and then relate it back to how tortured she must be, how much time this really takes. And you really see the depth of her suffering. It is, like I said, indescribable. It is so sobering and so sad and lamentable, and it is... There are no words, really. And so I don't think anyone can ever relate to what she's been going through. But at the same time, Eren can relate to her feelings of being a slave, feelings of not being free. And he contrasts her in that he has defied these sorts of things. He's fought back. She has accepted these burdens, the burdens of being caged. She accepted this blame. Whereas Eren has taken the opposite sort of tact and fought back against the world. Sometimes that's all it takes, a foreign opinion, an opinion from a third party, to just sort of broaden the mind, broaden the scope. That is a bit of a weird parallel, but that is something I love about the thematics of one of my favorite video games, Final Fantasy X. One of the core tenets and facets and themes of that work is that in a cycle of violence, in a cycle of what seems like redundant misery that seems to never end, sometimes all it takes is a foreign opinion, a foreign person to come in from somewhere different and show to you that you don't have to keep thinking about things the way you are. It's something very, very tricky, very interesting about the human psychology. We get stuck in these negative feedback loops and think about these sorts of things and don't really see a way out for ourselves, or don't really find ourselves able to think in a different way because we're just so stuck with this same mentality we've always had. And sometimes all it takes is another perspective or another voice. That is what Eren is for Ymir here. He says to her the words she's needed to hear her entire life, and basically opens her eyes here, literally, as we see her eyes for the first time. The sheer emotionality in her eyes for the first time. And that is very, very telling. For the first time, she seems like a real human girl, as Eren said she is. A real human girl who has the choice to decide what she wants to do, as the veil is lifted here, and she cries that tear. Your heart just goes out to her here. But it's a groundbreaking moment for her because she's able to carry out these things with Eren's help. And so she enlists her aid to Eren here. She doesn't carry out the euthanasia plan, she does it to Eren. Notably, a big contrast is with her and Zeke. It's not a coincidence that Zeke very much resembles the late King Fritz, who would only ever order her as a slave. He resembles him in appearance, his beard, his aged self, the longer hair. He resembles him in appearance, especially after the time skip, the older King Fritz. And that's not a coincidence. Both treated her like a slave. Eren treats her like a girl, like a person who's worthy of freedom, who's able to make choices. And she responds to that, because it's what she's been yearning for all this time. So sorry I jumped ahead there, I just felt like that was a natural way to continue the discussion. The OP occurs, then we get this sequence starting with Historia and Frida. Again, the music very emotional, again, really nailing home that tender emotional core and feel. And what I loved about this is that we're well acquainted with Historia's backstory. The only person she ever really found solace and connection in was Frida. But her life was very lonely, very similar to the original Ymir, in a different type of loneliness, of course, but she was a very lonely girl. And so her time spent with Frida were very fleeting, because as we know, she'd lose memory afterwards. Frida would force her to forget these things when she would leave her. So these were so fleeting, literally, she would forget about them. They would be the only bright spots in her life, in her early life, and she would have to forget them. And it's such an emotional concept. It's such an emotional situation because this is her only shining light. This is the only time where she felt real joy, real connection to someone, like she mattered as a person, as a human being. And I think the music being used here really got that across. It's always been a flashback that really got to me because I really empathize with Historia here. I can't really relate to her, but I feel tons of sympathy, and I don't know, I think the story does a really good job of keying us into her mentality and how lonely and sad this period of time in her life was, and how big a shining light Frida was. Again, indirectly, or not indirectly, but characterizing Frida and showing what she was like, to add on to her hesitation to want to kill Grisha. Frida was a good woman, and so Frida talks to her about what it means to be ladylike, and she refers to Ymir, the girl in the story. Being ladylike is being like this girl, someone who is always kind to others, someone who was always nice to others, always liked. But as those lines are overlaying beautifully emotional integration and editing, it flows really well together. As all that's happening, we see that mentality, that altruism, can sometimes be so self-destructive to the point of you give and you give and you give, and then what is left? Absolutely nothing. Ymir was someone that was, this kind, ladylike person who was kind to others and accepted blame and was nice to others, and that people liked because they were able to foster blame onto her, and she was the source and the beacon of suffering and misery. And so she took that to its most unsavory extreme. And I think that says something about this sort of altruism, about how it can be self-detrimental, about how not being one's own self and not having one's own ambitions and not thinking of oneself can lead to such inhumane things. In a world like this especially, you have to look out for number one. And Ymir never did, and I'm not blaming Ymir for this at all. None of this is her fault, of course. But she was born into a situation where she never even thought that I can live for myself, right? And so I think it puts a very dark twist on what Frida's talking about there. Being ladylike means being kind to others and all of that. But sometimes that can be a very dark thing. Trying to be someone that everyone loves, when is that ever really fulfilling if it's not your genuine self, right? That speaks of Historia's Krista persona, and all the stuff that happens that we explore through her character, but also of who Ymir ended up being, the type of person she ended up being, and what led her to become what she became. All that sort of thing can lead to the chains that end up binding Ymir and all sorts of people, different types of chains, different types of cages. And eventually we get to the point where Ymir accepts the blame. We see looks, again, grayed out eyes throughout the entire populace, every single character in this time, I think to show, on one hand, through the citizens, out of sight, out of mind, clear eyes see the truth, and the truth is a precursor to freedom. And these people are so far from free. And I'm talking about truth as in conceptual truth, like not literal truth. Truth as in, an honest world, a free world, and being able to see that. It's no coincidence that the first time anyone from this era, their eyes come to be clear, Ymir's, is when they, for the first time in their life, realize the true nature of the world and commit to changing something, to taking a stand. But these people, eyes clouded over, are not willing to do that. They're not willing to, see the world for what it is and fight against it or carry out their desires. They just need to survive and get by. That's just what this world has come to. And to survive and get by, they need to blame Ymir. And I think there's a different sort of approach to the king's eyes being clouded over in that way, or shadowed over, because obviously he's not in the same situation as the populace, whose eyes are clouded over, but I think it's just for visual consistency to carry forward this theme of those olden days and the the outlook towards truth and freedom there, just to carry it out visually consistently, but also at the same time to dehumanize him. When you see someone's eyes, it helps you see them more as a person. But by clouding over his eyes, it emphasizes that King Fritz was an inhumane monster. And that's what I get from it personally. Anyway, she accepts the burden, she accepts the blame, everything we've talked about. Great visual direction with the red tinge as they all point at her and the camera pans up. Loved how that was presented. And he says, "You are free." Very similar to, the idea of freedom, that false horizon that Eren saw. You are free, as in she's free to wander the woods and try to escape, but she's never really free. Just as Eren would look at the false horizon and know there's just some more death and conflict and confines beyond that sea. Just more pain and savagery. It's not true freedom, and it never has been. And that's the tragedy of this sort of world. So she's hunted down, she finds this tree, and beautiful background art, beautiful art of the tree. She goes in, she slips, she makes contact with all living matter. It seems as though what Kruger said to Grisha about Ymir, some say that she touched the essence of all living matter. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it seems that what he said there ended up being true. She touched this, she became the Titan, she gained Titan's powers, and all of that, but began being used as a commodity, began being used as someone to breed with, to carry on this power for King Fritz. She was never taken away from those shackles. She always had them around her, from life till death, and yet she seemingly cared for him enough to sacrifice herself. But before we get there, as the passage of time goes on, we see these war-torn scenes, very well presented. Again, that color palette taken to its extreme, the sepia-esque tone, with these war-torn scenes, very violent. They didn't censor anything. We see heads on spikes, fire everywhere, and we see that cruel but beautiful duality. We see fire and ash in one scene, and that directly cuts to a scene where petals are flowing down. Yet at the same time, the one thing that remains consistent is that Ymir is suffering. People are suffering. There is constantly pain. The world is cruel and beautiful, but at this moment, there is no beauty to be seen, except unless from like a shallow point of view. If you look at those petals and say, wow, that's beautiful. But there is really no beauty to be seen here. It is just cruelty. And these people cannot find it within themselves to see any beauty. And who can blame them? I can't see any beauty at that point in time. I'm certain you can't either. But I find it interesting that visually, from the ashes and fire to the petals in the sky, direct cut, I think that's very much a cruel but beautiful theme visually, as Attack on Titan loves to do. And they did it before that as well with the blood on the flower that Ymir sees. Just one thing, I just realized I talked about the petals and the ashes and the duality, cruel is beautiful, etc. That actually occurred prior to the time skips and the passage of time. It was before Ymir took on that burden, but nonetheless, everything I said still holds true. It just didn't happen at that time. I just want to clarify that. I didn't really clarify that when I was talking about it. Just want to say it happened before. But yeah, she sacrifices himself for the man who's been inhumanely treating her as a slave this entire time. That self-detrimental altruism, those chains, and transports herself to the past dimension. I talked about her sheer loneliness here in the mechanics of this dimension, so I won't repeat myself. But yeah, all that loneliness, everything there, as King Fritz's words drone on in the background. Just so awful. But then, you could see I actually got scared. Eren completely cuts that off, completely just stops it. And he says, this ends now. This is it. I'm sick of this shit. Completely against that mentality, Eren busts in. Like I said, that foreign voice, that external factor. Zeke is talking to her. She's not quite listening as Eren gets through to her. And again, like I described that before, so I'm not going to dive into that a lot. But again, we have that chorus, that haunting chorus, as it goes slow-mo, and we see the tear. Monumental moment, arguably the biggest moment in the series, definitely one of them. We see Ymir's eyes. She, for the first time, is seen to be a person. So there are just some things that I want to clarify and add to with regards to Ymir and Eren's outlook on her and all of that I didn't quite talk about in the discussion that I want to bring attention to. Firstly, she dies as a Titan shifter. The reason that happens is because she loses the will to live. What had happened is that, well, it's been established previously in the story, the declaration of war, the Liberio invasion, that Titan shifters need to have the will to live to regenerate, right? We see it through Reiner's lack of a will to live. So that's been established. What happens here is she goes to save King Fritz, having been born into this world and not even conceptualizing that there is more for her in this world than what she's seen, this self-detrimental altruism, this, that's the best way to put it, basically, this bearing the burden of other people and just being a slave, being burdened, being confined. She doesn't see there to be anything other than that in life. So she develops a form of kind of Stockholm syndrome here, saving the king, saving his life despite him being so awful to her. I talked about this already. But she does this in the futile hopes that regardless of how he's treated her, how horribly he's treated her, he will show something to her. Appreciation, gratitude, connection, love, whatever. He will show something to her that shows that he's appreciative or acknowledges it. What does he show, though? Just coldness. Just says, get up. I do not permit you to die at this time. You are my commodity. You are my tool, my asset. And at that point, she just gives up hope. She gives up the will to live and she dies. And she gets transported to this path dimension. Love how she's shown in isolation, and then the dimension comes afterwards, showing her isolation there. Nice visual storytelling there. And so she becomes attuned with these powers, like I described before, that essentially help the Eldian Empire to thrive through these magical powers, this magic system. The core of it is formulated in this dimension. And so she carries out these things to carry forward the will of her captor, of King Fritz, the will of his legacy, because that's all she's known. You know, this awful, it's completely inhumane and awful, but all she knows, despite how horribly he's treated her, is that she wants to, or not even wants to, but feels she has to, that she's burdened to, obligated to carry out his will. So that's what she does in this dimension. That is why this all happened, this all started. So those are the mechanics for how this dimension came to be. Essentially granted, a combination of the power she was granted brought forth this dimension, combined with the will to carry on this will of King Fritz's. Sorry if my wording is a bit redundant, but you get what I mean. And interestingly enough, the Ymir curse, the curse of Ymir, that is the death sentence, the 13-year death sentence that happens whenever someone becomes a Titan shifter, that is because Ymir herself died 13 years after touching the source of all living matter. So nice detail there. Also, someone brought up in chat in my Twitch stream today, my Twitch discussion, that what do you think the mechanics are between self-immolation, self-harm, and leading to becoming a Titan? Whether it be stabbing yourself, biting yourself as Eren does, what's the connection there? Someone proposed that it may be because of this self-detrimental altruism. Could be a connection. Someone else proposed that it could be a reflection of the injuries she received prior to touching all living matter when she was hunted down in the forest. I think that's probably the connection that I agree most with, but both are valid, and I just think it's some interesting thought food. Anyways, with all this established about Ymir, we can see a parallel between her and Zeke. In a previous episode, in the previous discussion, I talked about how Eren would look at Zeke and criticize him and talk about how he is nothing like him because Zeke is built from the outside in. Zeke himself is formed as a result of his experiences, and Eren says that he has no central identity, no desires of his own. He only became this way because of his environment, and he's never had a semblance of identity from the start. This is very similar to Ymir, tragically, but this is the case. She's never had any agency, any freedom of choice, any individuality. She was born into a situation where she just assumed, this is what life is. I don't have choices. I am a slave. I am burdened. I am confined. This is what life is. And so she's very much like Zeke. And yet Eren pushes away Zeke, twists the knife in, and embraces Ymir. Now, I think that's for a few reasons. The first of which is I think Eren sees deep within her that she does have a desire, that there is a semblance of a desire for freedom. Not as monstrous and dark as his, but the same core want. I think he sees that within her because I think he sees a kinship within her. I think she has the same desires or similar desires as what he has, and he sees that within her. Also, The first thing he says, or one of the first things he says when he sees her, is he laments how lonely it must have been, being here for all this time, for an eternity. He can very much relate to that, being isolated for not an eternity, but for a long, long time. Basically, since he kissed Historia's hand, he's been feeling this isolation, this desolation, maybe not physically, but psychologically, emotionally in some way. So he can relate to her loneliness and feels compassion and empathy as a result of that. They have this core yearning for freedom, at least from Eren's perspective, and which we see seems to be the truth as her eyes come out for the first time after being given this choice, the first step. But whereas Eren acts out, she doesn't do anything. She doesn't search for more. And so for all these reasons, there are lots of parallels with Zeke. But for reasons I stated some of the reasons why she diverges from Zeke in Eren's eyes before, and also Zeke is obviously the spearhead of the euthanasia plan, which is so anti-Eren, it's unbelievable. So that's an obvious factor too. Zeke, in Eren's eyes, Zeke's form of freedom or prosperity is his worst nightmare, whereas Amir's is very similar to what he conceptualizes as freedom. So they diverge in lots of ways in this sort of situation. And Eren's interactions with the two, I think, tell a story of its own with regards to how he sees them, despite both of them have the key characteristics that Eren frames as very negative and almost pathetic for Zeke. Ymir has the same things, but there are nuances in the way she differs from Zeke in his eyes that make him want to embrace her, tell her that she has the choice, tell her that she's a human being, and for the first time in her life, have some agency. I love the expression on Eren's face. It's beautifully drawn. I'll show it on screen right now. Just this tenderness, this empathy, this compassion. Like I said, cynical people might say it's all part of his plan, but I think the presentation is clear in saying that he wanted the best for her in this moment as well. But in her eyes, as someone pointed out, there is an outpouring of adrenaline and some gratification there at finally being able to be given a choice. But the thing is, that face is one of, as well as relief and, this sort of pseudo-gratification, is also one of terror and fear, as she sees, she's able to express herself for the first time. I think it's an outpouring of emotions that she's felt. It's very similar to what someone said about Eren's face when he kissed Historia's hand. Very similar sort of expression. But what's notable is that it's not hugely fulfilling and totally gratifying and happy, similar to how the embrace between Zeke and Grisha was too little too late and not totally positive and fulfilling, as I talked about last week. This is not her, the clouds parting and her seeing everything and being completely fulfilled and that's it. Her trauma's over. She sees everything, she can make choices. No, this is a small step because she doesn't have pure agency. This choice was not brought about from within her. This choice was her choosing between two wills of two men who hoisted this choice upon her. Eren's rumbling will, Zeke's euthanasia will. And the only bit of freedom she's ever been given was Eren telling her, you can choose between me or Zeke. You don't have to choose Zeke because he's got royal blood, right? So Eren does a lot for her here through speaking to her as a human. He does some heinous things. The rumbling itself is a heinous thing. But I deeply appreciate what he does for her here, to help her come out of her shell, help her realize that she's a human being who can yearn for freedom. That isn't something that's out of reach or should be out of reach. And he speaks to her as a human here, and I love that. It continues to bring forth that dualism to Eren's character and the layers, and makes him much more interesting than he would be otherwise if he was just totally cold and detached. But Isayama has shown us through multiple ways that is not the case here. He has layers, empathy, compassion, perspective. He sees these things, and a lot of the actions he's doing are against that. And that underside to him is very much present here. But for Ymir, as important as this is to her, it is still like the basest of choices, the smallest of choices. It isn't really freedom, in any sense of the word. It's picking between two choices hoisted upon her by two men who essentially, Eren looks at her as a human girl, but essentially her power is being used here when it comes down to it. It isn't a choice she brought about herself, and so this is just the first step. She needs to do more to achieve real freedom and to be self-actualized and to become the person she's yearned for without knowing that deep down for forever. So what I want to emphasize here is that big moment for her, but it's not, everything isn't solved here. Far from it. She had been waiting for 2,000 years to be set free, and much longer than that in terms of what she'd experienced, and here Eren's able to do it. He has done some heinous things up until now, and after this point, continued to do heinous things, as we saw. But what he does here in freeing her it feels not like a means to an end. Obviously, he needed to harness her power to carry out this goal, but it feels very much to me like he also wanted to set her free. Whether it be because he wanted to feel vicarious gratification through her being set free, to an extent. She's not completely set free, but something's been unlocked for her. Whether he wanted to feel that vicariously, or whether he wanted it for her because he feels for her, I think it might be a combination of both, but primarily the latter. Because as we see, right in the beginning, one of the first things he said when he enters this place and sees Ymir is, she's been all alone this whole time. And that indicates how he feels about her. Very sympathetic, seeing things from her perspective, wanting more for her. For whatever reason. Like I said, bit of a combination of seeing himself in her a little bit perhaps, but also just wanting her to be benefited for herself, right? And so he speaks to her, and the rumbling begins in earnest. And the scenery, the tension, the music is just so cataclysmic, so destructive, and visceral. The walls completely crumble. The spine creature thing coming out of Eren, and he transforms, and we hear his scream, and he turns into this hulking, massive thing. Gabi looks on in horror. Pieck is on top of the wall and is screaming because it comes apart. Armin and Mikasa, they take shelter refuge on a roof. Reiner screaming out for Gabi. We see the Titans. We see one of the eyes come through the wall. And it's very sad to see Reiner's train of thought evolve throughout this whole thing. Eren did it. He did it. He won. We're good. He's doing the small-scale rumbling to ward off Marley, right? This is good, Mikasa. This is good for us. And then he starts to realize, this is more than that. This is the Titans on every single wall. This is a full-scale rumbling, and they're trampling everything, or about to. It's just so tragic because Armin has been holding out hope for Eren doing something for them. They've been hoping against hope that this is the guy they've come to care for and love all this time. Armin in particular, Armin and Mikasa mostly, most importantly. And he's had logic. That's had logical basis. There's logical basis throughout the entire series that Eren has a mask, and he's portraying this mask to the world. Armin sees it. But the thing is that no one's known is, to what end is this? What is he actually planning on doing? Do they know him? Do they know what he's going to do? He's not going to do the euthanasia plan. Armin knew this. But here, he's almost trying to convince himself, this common theme throughout these episodes of trying to convince oneself of something, that Eren wouldn't do this, right? He wouldn't do the full-scale thing. He wouldn't essentially bring about the apocalypse, would he? We just need to fight off Marley. We don't need this much. And Armin is slowly realizing it as he talks himself through it, and Mikasa just kind of looks on in horror, and then it's confirmed what's going on here. Eren transports all subjects of Ymir to the past dimension. We see, of course, the main four, Connie, Jean, Armin, and Mikasa, but then again we see the warriors, Reiner, Falco, Gabi, Pieck. We see Annie's father. We see Historia. We see Floch. We see the Jaegerists. We see all sorts of people. And he's saying, Eren is speaking to them, and again, that very clear, authoritative voice, great voice direction, just fantastic. And he says to them, "Hear me, all subjects of Ymir. My name is Eren Yeager. I now speak to the subjects of Ymir by way of the founding Titan's power." And by the way it flits in and out of the actual rumbling, reality, and the past dimension was really well done. Very drastic cuts. And the rumbling effect, the shaking of the screen, really well done. Eren says, "Every wall on the island of Paradis has been undone. All of the Titans buried within them have begun their march. My goal is to protect the people of Paradis, the land where I was born and raised. But the world desires the extinction of the people of Paradis. Over countless years, the world's hatred has grown beyond even the bounds of this island. The people of the world surely will not stop until they've killed every last subject of Ymir. I reject those wishes. The Titans of the Wall will thunder across the world to every land beyond this island. Their rumbling feet will snuff out every life in those lands." So what he's saying here, I will protect the people of Paradis, the subjects of Ymir. I will protect my people in the home where I was raised and born. But everything else I will destroy, I will kill, and everything will be tread on underfoot. It confirms what Armin was kind of grappling with at this point. This doesn't quite make sense. Why is he doing this? Now we know. Now, is he being completely truthful here? Because again, there's always been this aspect of Eren saying things and you not knowing, they being kind of extreme, and the audience and the characters not knowing whether to fully buy into it. At this point, I think it's fair to take things he says with a grain of salt. However, there is much more substance behind what he's saying at this point than any other point, because the proof is in the pudding, right? He's completely started the full rumbling, and it's begun. He seems to be fully intended on carrying out this plan, and it's disturbing to him and his friends. They all look shocked in this dimension. Historia has an interesting glance upwards as she looks at what's going on, but everyone else seems shocked and horrified. Sorry, just one final thing to add here. As I'm talking about all the characters who are in the Paths realm, I just want to clarify that I don't believe that they're literally being transported into the Paths realm as much as it being sort of a symbolic or abstract representation of the fact that Eren is communicating to them through paths. That's how I've always interpreted it, though I could be wrong. Maybe they do get transported there, but just clarifying my wording on that. Secondly, I think what's really interesting is that the anime adds in, they have a really great frame of Floch, where we see him down on one knee, sort of bending and bowing in complete shock. And there are a couple of ways you can interpret this. First of all is, Floch has always been vehemently for Eren's plan, for the rumbling, right? So you can always just look at that and look at the shock on his face and say, like, it's a momentary lapse of that, where he's horrified at what's happening. But also, the more I look at it, the more I think that looks like a bow of, like, reverence, of worship, of, wow, like, Eren has done it. He really is this god or this devil that we've needed. It's like a shock. It's like a shocked, odd bow of servitude, almost, that the plan he's been dreaming about has come to fruition. So I think it's a really lovely additional shot and a really sort of complex and nuanced image of Floch there. Lots of food for thought. I thought it was I'm really glad that they added it into the anime. And then they hear his plan and take it in at this point, take in this vast amount of shocking information. And then what do we end with? That horrifying, menacing, terrifying face of this new Titan that's been erected. This new Founder Titan, Attack Titan, Rumbling Titan hybrid that Eren is embodying. And there's this sort of visual effect that's kind of like a static effect, where I think it's done to sort of show the distortion in his plan or whatever, the darkness in there. But it's also done because he's speaking to them and transmitting his voice. It's almost like a radio signal. And I sort of got that same vibe from the visuals. There seemed to be static. Maybe I'm looking too much into it, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. But then that's the scene we're left with. This terrifying, hulking face, the leader of the rumbling, the spearhead, to trample underfoot the rest of the planet and protect his home and protect the people that he cares for and the subjects of Ymir. And what will happen from here on out, we shall see. How will people respond? People on the Marley side, people on the Paradis side. Remains to be seen. But this was a fantastic episode. Nothing really else to say to sum it up. It was fantastic. I've talked about all I really want to talk about, I think, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Really, really loved it, aside from that one little bit where they fumbled on that Eren moment, the scenery moment. But that aside, no complaints at all. I loved it. It was great. And I'm really looking forward to what they do with the future material, to see if they adapt things in ways that I might be able to appreciate things in a different way, or adapt things in a more creative way, etc. We'll see. Just very much looking forward to future episodes. Thank you very much for joining me again. I had a blast. I hope you enjoyed listening to this, and we'll see you in the next one. Again, you can follow my Twitch for these episode discussions every Monday morning, and check my Patreon if you want early access to the next episodes right now. That aside, many thanks for watching.